Hey everybody, this is a section from The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Lost Texts of Critical Marxism, edited by Sean Matgamna. Um, this piece, the pieces in here appears to be one by Albert Goldman, one from Liber Action, one from Max Shachtman, and one from Stanley Plastrik. Uh, 1 second. Wikipedia says Albert Goldman was a Belarusian born American political and civil rights lawyer closely associated with the American Communist Party. He lived from 1897 to 1960. Goldman broke with mainline Communist Party USA in 1933, joining the Trotskyist opposition, in which he would be a leading participant for the better part of the next 2 decades. Albert Goldman is best remembered as a defendant and lead defense attorney in the 1941 Smith Act prosecution of the leadership of the Socialist Workers' Party for opposing America's involvement in World War II. Goldman was sentenced to 16 months in prison. So that's the first piece is by Albert Goldman. Let's party. It's by Albert Goldman. The Sovietization of the Baltic Step Forward. This is from Socialist Appeal, the Socialist Workers' Party Journal, July 27th, 1940. When the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, at its next meeting, will grant the petitions of the parliaments of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia to be incorporated into the Soviet Union, and no doubt exists, but that it will once more be evidence of the fact that the foundations of the October Revolution are still operative in spite of Stalin. The basic achievement of the Red October, the nationalization of private property and the means of production, is extended to other territories, and no class-conscious worker can raise any objection to that. The Sovietization of the Baltic states reminds us of the controversy that raged in our party before the minority, unwilling to remain a minority and cocksure of the correctness of its fantastic theories, decided to set up a little shop of its own. When Stalin first sent the Red Army into the Baltic states and limited itself to stationing soldiers at important bases, the minority gleefully pointed out that Stalin was leaving capitalist relations in those states intact, which would prove, according to the leaders of the minority, that Stalin was not interested in destroying capitalism, a position which we never contradicted. What the leaders of the minority failed to see was that once Stalin, for any reason whatever, acquires control over territory where capitalist property relations exist, the tendency must be for Stalin to incorporate such territory into the Soviet Union, and upon incorporation, capitalist property relations must be destroyed and displaced by nationalized property. Stalin is not interested in extending the social revolution. He is interested primarily in the rule of the bureaucracy which he represents. But since Stalin heads a state based on nationalized property, any territory acquired by that state cannot be left under capitalist property relations. The ruling class in the Soviet Union cannot afford to divide its power with an alien ruling class. Should Stalin permit capitalism to function in any territory that had become part of the Soviet Union, it would mean that he was actually determined to bring capitalism back to the Soviet Union. How grotesque and senseless the, quote, theory of Soviet imperialism must appear to anyone who thinks in Marxist terms. Every piece of territory into which Stalin sent his armed forces and which has been incorporated into the Soviet Union has been wrested from imperialism. The kind of imperialism that Marxists know of as existing at the present time, the expansionist policy of finance capitalism. The resources of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania are no longer open to imperialist exploitation unless they are taken away from the Soviet Union. and superficial wiseacres will still contend that there is no difference between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. But these people have never yet explained why it is that Hitler never called the Reichstag to proclaim the nationalization of land, banking, and industry in any conquered territory. Individual capitalists, especially Jewish capitalists, run away from Hitler's rule. The capitalist class, as such, is expropriated under Stalin's rule. We do not like the bureaucratic socialization of industry. We would much rather prefer socialization of industry coming as a result of a social revolution than as the result of a conquest of territory by the Red Army under Stalin, and it is obvious that Stalin's bureaucratic method can only conquer small countries. But as against capitalism, even bureaucratic socialization is a step forward, and we shall support it as against all people who, for any pretext whatever, will defend capitalism. That the working masses of the Baltic countries are as enthusiastic about their incorporation into the Soviet Union as the Stalinist press would want us to believe can be seriously doubted. They live too close to the Soviet Union, and they therefore know too much about real conditions there to be enthusiastic about the happy life promised them under the leadership of the Kremlin despot. But the lot of the workers and peasants of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia under capitalism has been a miserable one at best. Probably hundreds of thousands of them cannot picture anything worse than what they have experienced. The class-conscious workers of the Baltic countries, however, understand that capitalism throughout the world must be destroyed, that it offers nothing but fascism and war. These workers will support the nationalization of industry, and together with their class brothers in the Soviet Union, they will continue the struggle against the Stalinist bureaucracy. The corruption of Stalinism must be destroyed in order to make the Soviet Union the powerful, attractive force that it should be for the masses throughout the world. Part 2 of this section. This is a piece from Labor Action. It's titled, Stalin Fastens Hold on Baltic Republic, Liberation Lies Only on the Path of Socialist Revolution. Stalinist Russia has annexed the three small Baltic countries, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, after controlled elections brought out close to 100% vote for, quote, affiliation to the Soviet Union. This action concludes the process of Russian control over these states, which began after the Hitler-Stalin Pact of last August and the establishment of Russian military and naval bases there. Last month, whole divisions of Russian troops were sent into the Baltic countries, and with their aid, the old national governments were ousted. The new, quote, Soviet republics have decreed the expropriation of the old landowning class and the state ownership of land. The declaration of the, quote, Latvian Republic, for example, limits land ownership, quote, at no more than 30 hectares, about 75 acres. Quote, any attempt to encroach on the private peasant property or to thrust on the laboring peasantry against their will the organization of collective farms will be strictly punishable as acts detrimental to the interests of the people and the state, end quote. Whatever the pious promises of Stalin, the masses of the Baltic states who suffered under the brutal exploitation of their native landowners and capitalists and the reactionary dictatorships are now the subject peoples of the more powerful tyrant in the Kremlin. Land is now state property. Tomorrow the factories will also become the property of the state. But the state machine is the instrument of the oppressive Russian bureaucracy. This ruling group can maintain and extend its power and revenue most effectively through such state ownership. In newly annexed territories, it can tolerate the old ruling property classes, capitalist owners of factories and banks, and landowners for any extended period of time, because this would mean a disruption of Russia's statified economy and future political opposition fostered by these old ruling elements. The expropriation of the reactionary property-owning classes by Stalinist Russia is not undertaken in order to bring freedom and security to the masses, but rather to gain for the Russian bureaucrats themselves the results of the toil and sweat of the workers and peasants. That is why revolutionary socialists, the genuine defenders of the interests of the workers and peasants who are for the working people taking over the land and factories and banks from the big landowners and capitalists and collectively utilizing these resources for the common good of the people, condemn the reactionary annexations of these countries by Russia. In the Baltic countries, as in Russia itself, the masses can benefit from these resources only if they overthrow the despotic Stalinist government and organize their own workers' and peasants' government. At the same time, revolutionary socialists refuse to take seriously protest against Stalinist reactionary measures by capitalist imperialist governments and their spokesmen. Last Tuesday, Sumner Welles, United States Acting Secretary of State, denounced the Russian annexation of the Baltic countries in a statement, according to the New York Times, quote, the vigor of which stamped it as one of the most exceptional diplomatic documents issued by the State Department in many years, end quote. No doubt Sumner Welles smiled cynically when he wrote that these states had, quote, independent and democratic, end quote, forms of government, and when everyone knows that they were organized after the World War's puppet buffer states against Soviet Russia, were controlled by one or another imperialist power and had dictatorial governments. However, this statement correctly declares, quote, the people of the United States are opposed to predatory activities, no matter whether they are carried on by the use of force or by the threat of force. They are likewise opposed to any form of intervention on the part of one state, however powerful, in the domestic concerns of any other sovereign state, however weak, end quote. The people, yes, Sumner Welles, ask the people of Cuba who remember this gentleman who, quote, by the use of force or by the threat of force, end quote, decided which group of rogues should control the Cuban government in the best interest of American imperialism. The Roosevelt government? Ask the Latin American people about Yankee imperialism. The people, above all the workers, must see through this fraud in order to more effectively to struggle against all forms of reaction and oppression and for freedom and security. Section 3. This is a piece by Max Shachtman titled The Canaanites and Iran, Silence is Golden. This is from Labor Action, September 8th, 1941. The subjugation of Iran by Anglo-Stalinist imperialism is all but completed now. The oil fields and refineries are already under the direct control of the invaders. So are the strategical railroads and highways. Hitler's agents and spies are on their way as fast as they can run or be deported. All that is left to Shah Reza Pahlavi. I think it's Pahlavi is how you actually say it now, but it's with a. I think it's spelled different here than how it's spelled in contempt now. At this writing is nominal police control of the capital and the assurance that he will continue getting his little rake off on every barrel of oil pumped out of Iran's wells. What is the essential difference between the assault on Denmark or Holland by Hitler and the assault on Iran by Churchill and Stalin? The professional Democrats and warmongers in the United States wept tears of indignation at the former and shouted cheers of enthusiasm at the latter. That is understandable, because they are people without honorable principle, scruples, or sense of shame. In both cases, the invaders claimed that the victim's territories were being converted by the enemy into a war base against himself. In both cases, the invader destroyed the sovereignty of the victim in the name of preserving its sovereignty. In both cases, the invader claimed that his action was purely defensive. In both cases, the invader claimed that he was only helping keep the victim from being drawn into the war. In both cases, the invader declared that he was taking the initiative only in order to prevent the enemy from taking the initiative. And in both cases, lo and behold, the invader was so surprised to find economic wealth in the territory of his victim that he promptly decided to loot it and establish a military police regime to protect him while the looting was going on. In a word, in both cases the imperialists acted as imperialists always have. Yet there is a difference so far as our, quote, Democrats are concerned. What is it? Simply this. In the one case, it is, quote, the other fellow's, end quote, imperialism, and in another case, it is, quote, our imperialism. A reader might object by saying, what else can you expect from the apologists for imperialist degradation? The objection is well taken. Nothing else can or should be expected. But the same objection does not hold true for the Canaanites. For example, from them something quite different should be expected. But what is to be expected and what you actually get are two different things. The last issue of the Militant, the organ of the Socialist Workers' Party, and all the space at its disposal, did not have one single word to say about the invasion of Iran. Although it went to press plenty of time after the event to make possible some comment, a paragraph, say, or at least a sentence, but we found neither a paragraph nor even a single syllable. For the Canaanites, the invasion of Iran does not exist. Why not? When Stalin, in concert with Hitler, invaded Poland, the Canaanites, to be sure, only after we, and then Trotsky, had prodded them into it, were ready to denounce Stalin's act as, quote, criminal and shameful, end quote. But when Stalin, in concert with Churchill, invades Iran, The Canaanites not only do not denounce it as, quote, criminal and shameful, end quote, or as anything else, but they do not characterize it at all. They pretend it just isn't there. They stuff their ears, eyes, noses, yes, noses as well, because the invasion stinks of oil, and mouth with austere silence. Can this be because the invasion of Poland was carried out in alliance with a fascist imperialism, whereas the invasion of Iran was carried out in alliance with a nice, popular, quote, democratic imperialism? Can it be that the Canaanites, quote, denounced in 1939 because of bourgeois democratic pressure, but did not, quote, denounce in 1941 because there is no bourgeois democratic pressure upon them to do so now? We haven't had much luck with questions similar to those asked above, which we have put to the Canaanites before, but perhaps persistence will yet succeed in piercing their all-inspiring taciturnity. It's worth another try. The Canaanites are, for the, quote, unconditional defense of the Soviet Union, end quote, in any war with a capitalist imperialist country. Poland, for example, was such a country. Let us assume that Iran, a semi-colonial country, is in any case a tool of capitalist imperialist power. As a, quote, defensist, Canada is in favor of revolutionists being the, quote, best soldiers, end quote, in the Red Army. He is also for revolutionists being the, quote, best soldiers, end quote, in the American and presumably also in the British armies. We ask, what kind of soldiers should revolutionists be in the Iranian army? Further, the, quote, defensist position is for the victory of the Red Army in the war, is for political opposition in the army of Stalin's imperialist allies. It is for defeat, for military defeatism, with all that this implies, in the army of Stalin's enemy, for example, the army of Iran. Our question is, in what part of Iran and in what part of the Iranian army are the Canaanites for defeatism? In the north, which is invaded by Stalin, in the south, which is invaded by Stalin's ally, British imperialism, or in both? Also, which part of the Iranian army should be called upon to desert to the Stalinist army, which according to one astrologer in the militant is now, quote, Trotsky's Red Army, end quote, and which part, if any, should desert to Wavell's army? Further, we think we know what the Canaanite position would be if and when the Iranian people were to rise in a revolutionary movement against imperialism. What we do not know is this. Would the, quote, defensists call upon the people of Iran now, or 2 weeks ago, to arm themselves and drive the British imperialists and or the Stalinists out of Iran and proclaim the full national independence of the country? Such questions might have been set aside as, quote, general or, quote, hypothetical 5 or 10 years ago. Today, however, they are specific, concrete, and real. Will the Canaanites answer them? Or are suspicious people right in believing that the only way they can defend their position on Russia in the war is by swathing themselves in impenetrable layers of golden silence? This is part 4 of this section. It's a piece by Henry Judd, Stanley, Plastrik, once more on invasion of Iran. See if there's anything for Stanley Plastrik on the internet. It looks like Stanley Plastrik was an editor of Dissent, which leads me to believe he was part of the Workers' Party. Yeah, I think that's the case. Yeah, I'm looking at his the stuff by him that's on Marxist.org, and it's all from New International and Labor Action. Barrister Albert Goldman, leading spokesman for the Socialist Workers' Party Cannon Group, devoted a lengthy column to Iran in the Militant of September 6. He waxes morally indignant at the invasion as imperialist and reactionary. Heaven forbid. No. Goldman is indignant at those who condemn the invasion. They are, quote, petty bourgeois moralists, end quote, who, as the Daily Worker tells us each day, cannot see that it is all for the good of, quote, defending the Soviet Union. Here runs Goldman's argument. Russia is a, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote. It is fighting for its existence against German imperialism. It must take, quote, every measure necessary for its defense provided it does not conflict with the interests of the world revolution, end quote. The fact that Iran is invaded, quote, at the same time, end quote, by British imperialism. Notice how Attorney Goldman makes it appear that the joint invasion is merely coincidental in time, whereas both governments announced they undertook it as a joint, deliberately planned action, is not of, quote, the slightest importance, end quote. Conclusion. All class-conscious workers and peasants, including those of Iran, naturally, quote, will not permit anything to interfere with the defense of the Soviet Union, end quote. That is, the people of Iran should welcome their invaders and join with them, or is it only the Russian invaders who should be welcome, Comrade Goldman? What does this position mean? It is nothing but a total whitewash for Stalinism and its action in the war. It is nothing but a total whitewash for Stalinism and its action in the war. Is this a harsh judgment? Consider for a moment. Goldman is telling the people of Iran that they must subordinate themselves, their interest as colonial slaves, their interest as people who seek national freedom, to the military needs of Stalinist Russia and by indirection, to the military needs of the British Empire. For the British Empire is allied with Stalinist Russia in the war. It conducts joint military action with Russia. Any step taken by the people of Iran, or any other colonial country for that matter, cannot but have an effect upon Russia and Britain. If this is true for Iran, is it not also true for every other country that Germany threatens to drag into the war against Russia? Turkey, Iraq, India, etc.? Does Goldman contend that the 3,000 Germans in Iran were, quote, threatening the defense of the Soviet Union, end quote? Obviously, he must, or else there is no justification for Russia's Iranian invasion. But this is precisely the cynical excuse given by British imperialism for its share in the invasion, an excuse to cover up its real motives, namely, to secure its oil fields, to protect the road to its Indian colony, to establish air and naval bases, etc. Goldman would like to ignore the unpleasant fact, but Russia is not fighting its war in a vacuum. It is already up to its ears in the mud and filth of British imperialism and its dirty doings. Nor is Goldman untainted by the Stalinist cynicism he now apologizes for. He refers to the treaty between the Soviet government and Iran in 1921. This treaty gives Russia the right to march troops into Iran if the Iranian government is unable to prevent an attack or a threatened attack upon the Soviet Union through Iran, such as Article 6 of the Constitution. But our barrister forgets Article 2, which 1 unqualifiedly rejects as a, quote, criminal policy, the policy of the Tsarist government toward Iran, which consisted of concluding treaties with European powers, quote, whose objective was a gradual annexation, end quote. Furthermore, 2, quote, the Russian Soviet government declares its renunciation of participation in any measures which aim at a weakening or violation of the sovereignty of Persia, Iran, and declares that all conventions and agreements between the former government of Russia and third states injurious and relating to Persia, Iran, are abolished and nullified. I want to repeat that because it's all in italics. Quote, the Russian Soviet government declares its renunciation of participation in any measures which aim at weakening or violation of the sovereignty of Persia, Iran, and declares that all conventions and agreements between the former government of Russia and third states injurious and relating to Persia, Iran, are abolished and nullified, end quote. To what disgraceful depths has Goldman stooped? Stalin in 1941 jointly carves up Iran with Churchill. Lenin in 1921 would have marched into Iran to stand by the side of the Iranian people against a British invasion. Stalin marches to meet Churchill in comradely embrace. Lenin would have marched to meet him in mortal revolutionary combat. And Goldman says these are one and the same thing. Conclusions. 1. The Cannon Group and its spokesman here, as in other instances, act as shamefaced apologists for the crimes of Stalinism. 2. This apologism is being extended to include the momentary, quote, allies of Stalinist Russia, beginning with Great Britain. 3. The enslaved colonial peoples, victimized by both warring camps, are looked upon by the Socialist Workers' Party as abject pawns in the World War. the colonial movement for independence, an essential part of the world revolution, is subordinated to, quote, defense of the Soviet Union, end quote. 4. The logic of defensism in the present war appears to lead inescapably from, quote, critical support of the Stalinist bureaucracy, end quote, to critical support, or shall we say, critical support for the, quote, democratic imperialist war camp. I guess that means critical in the sense of one being like critical in the sense that, you know, we're used to using it in the Marxian philosophical way, and versus critical in the sense of important. Critical as in the sense of crucial. Anyway, the end. Thanks for listening.